This evening we're here to listen to Jane Draycott, who is a historian archaeologist and the author of Cleopatra's Daughter, Egyptian Princess, Roman Prisoner, African Queen. She's currently lecturing in Ancient History at the University of Glasgow and co-director of the University of Glasgow's Games and Gaming Lab. Today she's going to be in conversation with her friend Rebecca Usherwood, who teaches in Trinity College. She's the assistant professor in late antique and early Byzantine studies. The format of the event will be a short reading followed by discussion, and then we'll have some time for questions from the floor. And also we have copies of Jane's book, Fulvia, the woman who broke all the rules in ancient Rome, for sale afterwards, and she'll be very happy to sign copies. Just for a bit of context, Fulvia, according to Cicero, was a thoroughly rapacious woman, as cruel as she is greedy. And according to Plutarch, was a woman who took no thought for spinning or housekeeping and was meddlesome and headstrong. So this charismatic Fulvia amassed a degree of military and political power that was unprecedented for a woman in ancient Rome. Married 3 times to men who moved in powerful circles, including Marc Antony, Fulvia was not content to play the usual background role that was expected of a wife. Instead, she challenged the Roman patriarchy and sought to increase her influence in the face of determined opposition. So could you please welcome Jane Draycott and Rebecca Usherwood.
Good evening.
Good evening.
So we're here today to discuss Jane's second book, written for a general audience, Fulvia, the woman who broke all the rules in ancient Rome. So Fulvia was a Roman woman of high status who lived in the last generation of the Roman Republic, which was a time marked by chaos and bloodshed and civil war that reached everywhere, even the very streets of the city of Rome, and it was a very dangerous time to be alive, even for a woman, especially for a woman of high status who was married to many of the people who were directly involved in the civil war and the chaos. And you are likely to have heard of some of the sort of events of this time period, so famously the assassination of Julius Caesar during a meeting of the Senate on the Ides of March in 44 BCE. And the affair between Caesar's lieutenant, Marc Antony, and the Egyptian queen, Cleopatra, and then the showdown between Marc Antony and Octavian, who went on to become Augustus, the first Roman emperor. And not only did Fulvia live through all of these events, but she was a direct participant in many of them. All of her 3 husbands met violent ends of different ways, and then she had a very interesting conflict with another very famous member of the late Republic, Cicero, the famous statesman, and got the best of him in that he was proscribed, so he was killed during the second triumvirate. And as the story goes, that we'll hear more about in a moment, she was presented with Cicero's decapitated head and took a pin from her hair and stabbed his decapitated head in the tongue. And you may have heard of this sort of vignette of vicious female behavior, and it is what is in fact depicted on the front of this in lovely lavish color here. But Fulvia is really less known than other women of this time period, especially than other men of this time period. She died in sort of sad situation in exile in Greece, abandoned by her husband Marc Antony, who quickly went on to marry the future Emperor Augustus's sister. And in popular culture, her story has really been eclipsed by other Roman and non-Roman women, such as Livia, Augustus's wife, and especially Cleopatra. She's mentioned in passing in Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, but has been basically erased from a lot of other takes on the late Republic. So I'm not sure if anyone here has seen HBO Rome. I'm hoping it's going to have a renaissance soon because I'm a really big fan of it. It's 20 years old now. She does not appear in this at all. She's kind of excised because it would have been too complicated to include her. So she's all passed over in all of this. But in this book, Jane really sort of puts her back on the stage of this period gives real full appreciation of the roles that she could play within the very limited parameters of what women could do in this context, and gives this sort of detailed treatment through her life, from childhood, her first marriage as a young woman, as a girl, her 3 marriages, and then to her death. So we're going to start with Jane giving a short reading of, as I've just discussed, probably the most famous moment of Fulvia's career, and then we're going to have a discussion, and then we're going to open the floor to questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. So yes, I thought I would give a reading that gives you a bit of context into the image that is, well, it's somewhat, yes, it's up there. So in case you weren't familiar with Fulvia and her story, in case you hadn't had a chance to read the book, or you hadn't heard of her, I thought I would explain what is happening there. So, the most famous name on the triumvir's prescription list, both in antiquity and today, was Cicero. He, his son, his brother, and his nephew were all proscribed. And of the 4, only his son Marcus escaped because he happened to be abroad at the time. But Cicero's inclusion was not simply about the triumvir's need for money or their desire to neutralize opposition. Antony's enmity to Cicero went back a long way. 20 years before, in the wake of the Catilinarian conspiracy of 63 BCE, Antony's stepfather Cornelius Lentulus had been one of the conspirators that Cicero had summarily executed without trial. While the pair had had some semblance of a working relationship in the years since, it undoubtedly preyed on Antony's mind, and the minds of his mother and his brothers, to whom he was very close, both personally and politically. Then, the fact that Cicero had been open about his wish that the assassins of Caesar had assassinated Antony too, and his frequent exhortations that Antony should be assassinated since, and his Philippics made this personal. In later years, the question of whether Cicero should have attempted to gain a pardon from Antony in exchange for burning all his writings, first proposed by Antony's friend Asinius Pollio, would become a popular exercise for tutors to set their students of rhetoric. Fulvia, too, had her reasons for hating Cicero. He had publicly humiliated her sister-in-law Clodia in his speech in defense of Caelius in 56 BCE, and in the process cast aspersions on Clodius and the veracity of his and Fulvia's marriage by accusing the siblings of incest and Fulvia of adultery with Antony. He had not only opposed Clodius politically, but after his murder had defended his murderer and her son's attempted murderer. He had publicly insulted her father and another of her sons, and publicly excoriated Antony using numerous jibes about their marriage and Fulvia herself. On the 7th of December 43 BCE, Cicero was murdered at his villa. On Antony's orders, his head and hands were cut off and brought back to Rome so that they could be displayed on the rostra in the Forum, a stark warning to anyone who might be tempted to take up Cicero's mantle. It is at this point that one of the most famous episodes in Fulvia's life and career seems to have occurred. When Cicero's head was presented to her, she reportedly spat on it, then retrieved a hairpin from her elaborate coiffure and proceeded to stab his tongue. This bloodthirsty instance captured the imaginations not only of ancient commentators, but also numerous artists in later historical periods. What to make of these allegations? Roman hairpins are ubiquitous on archaeological excavations and in museum exhibitions, and it's easy to see that however elaborately and ornately decorated, when cast in metal or carved in bone, they could be quite lengthy and wickedly sharp. Women, otherwise unarmed, do seem to have used them as weapons when the occasion called for it. But Fulvia was hardly at risk from Cicero's decomposing head. If she did take out her frustrations on it in the manner described, might she have been treating it more in the manner of a colossus or voodoo doll, and attempting to bind it so it could no longer slander her and her nearest and dearest? Many ancient Roman curse tablets contain detailed instructions about the process of cursing and binding someone via the medium of stabbing a representation of them with pins and needles. Just as Cicero had once accused Fulvia of being a curse upon her husbands, she was now reflecting that back onto him and regaining her power and finally gaining the upper hand. This focus on Fulvia and the maximizing of her role in the prescriptions simultaneously serves to minimize Octavian's role in the entire process. As Cicero's one-time protege, yet the member of the triumvirate who added Cicero's name to the list, he was especially culpable. It's possible that one of the sources that ancient historians used for this period was Octavian's memoirs, and of course, when writing his account of events many years later in the mid-20s BCE, it would have suited him to deflect the blame onto Fulvia. By the standards of the day, it is not hard to see why Antony and Fulvia thought Cicero had it coming.
So this is your second book written for a general audience. Jane is a very impressive person because not only does she write books for general audiences, she also is a very accomplished scholar and a working academic at the University of Glasgow. Writing for a general audience as opposed to a scholarly audience is a really difficult skill in itself. And something that Jane is clearly very talented at doing. I'm very impressed by it. Your first book, Cleopatra's Daughter, we just heard about this, is about Cleopatra Selene, not to be muddled up with the Cleopatra, because she was the daughter of Cleopatra and Marc Antony, who happened to be Fulvia's third and final husband. Fulvia and Cleopatra Selene were a generation apart, and in Fulvia, in your new book, they kind of brush against each other in this story, particularly when you tell the story about how Marc Antony started this relationship with Cleopatra while he was still married to Fulvia. What is it about Cleopatra Selene and also Fulvia? What is it about their stories that really compelled you to tell the story about them?
For me, it's the fact that we know so much about that period of time, and we know so much about everybody else around them. When I say everybody else, I do mean primarily the men around them. When it comes to the women, apart from Cleopatra herself, there is generally not so much attention paid to the other women, the wives, the daughters of the Roman politicians and generals that are the sort of movers and shakers of this period. And it always seemed to me such an oversight, because if you excise the women from the stories of the men, you're losing a huge amount of context for what's going on. So yes, the Roman political system was patriarchal. There was no formal role for women. You could not be a female member of the Senate. You could not be a female magistrate. You could not be a female consul. You couldn't really be a female army commander. But what you could do, because almost every Roman politician was married and did have a mother, sisters, daughters, etc., what you could do as a woman was wield a whole lot of soft power. You were the person that was operating behind the scenes. You hosted the dinner parties and the soirees. You were the person that people came to, off the record to ask for favors. And we get this insight into how Roman politics worked in our histories of the period. And when we do tend to hear about women in detail, it's because they are stepping outside of these sort of prescribed places for them. And they're trying to do more, and they're trying to do what the male authors think is too much. And so this is why we know so much about Fulvia, for example, is because she gets a huge amount of criticism for daring to have ideas of her own and daring to have agency and initiative and working hard on behalf of her husbands. First Clodius, then Curio, and then finally Antony. And mostly Antony, because we know so much about him. Excuse me. And with Cleopatra Selene, it's a similar thing. She is the daughter of probably the most famous ancient woman that anyone could ever name, and one of the most famous Romans. She is the only one of Cleopatra's children that lives to adulthood. Excuse me, I'm sorry. She's the only one of Cleopatra's 4 children that lives to adulthood. Her 3 brothers all die very young, and they don't do anything. Yet they're the ones that get mentioned in the history books. Whereas Cleopatra Selene, she grows up, she becomes an adult woman, she becomes a queen of an independent kingdom. She goes out of her way to commemorate her mother and her father at a time when both of them were persona non grata, really, as far as Roman public life was concerned. But if you read about her kingdom and the period of her rule, she's ignored in favour of her husband and her son. And so that always seemed wrong to me. I've had a cold for the last few days, and it's been fine all day, and now I sit up here and I'm talking.
I'm going to move the water towards you again.
You.
So Cleopatra, Selene, and Fulvia had different upbringings, all of these things that would have shaped their lives. But do you see any sort of parallels between their stories then in that way?
I think they have parallels at the time in that they are both deciding for themselves that they want more than is automatically going to be allocated to them. They are not content simply to be wives and to be appendages of their husbands and to work solely for their husbands. They want to work for themselves, and they want to work for their children as well. And this is the other thing that is very important to think about ancient women, is that the vast majority of them would have been mothers. And it was through their maternity that they could later on wield some kind of influence and some kind of power, because Roman women were responsible for the education of their children and to bring them up to be politicians in waiting, generals in waiting, wives in waiting, etc. And so that is how they could later have influence as wives, as widows, etc. And so you have to bear that in mind, that they are working for the next generation always as well. And both Fulvia and Cleopatra Selene had children, and they wanted things for those children, first and foremost to preserve their lives, because Fulvia's children were frequently threatened by her husband's enemies, and they did come very close to violence on several occasions. And in fact, 3 of Fulvia's sons would die violently at the hands of Octavian, it must be said, ultimately. And for Cleopatra Selene, on her was the responsibility of continuing the Ptolemaic dynasty. So Egypt was conquered by the Romans, the Ptolemaic dynasty was deposed, and her brothers were either executed or they died mysteriously. And so she was the last surviving Ptolemy. And although she couldn't rule Egypt, she rules Mauritania, a neighboring African kingdom. And so she is the one who is going to pass on her dynastic heritage of 300 years, going all the way back to Alexander the Great. There's a reason that she names her son Ptolemy after her own family and not after his father and his father's family, who are not as prestigious as hers. And so when we sort of factor all of this in, we can see that these women have got plans. They are not silent, and they are not retiring and shy. They have ideas, they have plans, they work hard behind the scenes and in front of the scenes to put these plans into action. And they do have success. I mean, the fact that we still know about them today, when there are so many ancient women whose names we don't even know, is, I think, quite telling.
So Roman women, aristocratic women, had a very sort of delicate line to walk, because, as you said, they had a huge amount of soft power. And yet, if they were seen to sort of transgress these lines of propriety, they would be very open to slander. And even sort of Octavian's own sister could be open to slander. But we have this sort of unfairness in the way of that Fulvia gets really criticized for kind of pushing at the boundaries of what is acceptable to someone from her background, when really, by the standards of the time, she was a success story in a world that was sort of that framed women's reproductive potential. She bore every single one of her husbands a son. She had many children, and she always sort of upheld and supported the careers of her husbands, and yet she gets this incredibly sort of negative reputation in so many of the sources. When, for example, Octavia, the Emperor Augustus's wife, gets such a positive. Livia, Augustus's wife, Livia was Augustus's wife. She gets a little bit of a negative press if you have watched I, Claudius, for example.
Well, that's later in her life, isn't it? When she's a wicked mother and stepmother, as opposed to a good wife.
But all of these were dealing in tropes, because the whole idea of the wicked stepmother was a stereotype even within the Roman context, because it was assumed that women would always put their own children first and would not treat their stepchildren fairly. So what is it, do you think, that Fulvia was so open to criticism when other women of this time period who were not as successful as her or lived very similar lives to her were not criticized in this way?
It's, again, we have to look at the historical context and the cultural context of this period. So for men, the absolute worst allegation that you could make to another man, a Roman man, was you could impugn his masculinity. Anything from his clothing to his hairstyle to his use of cosmetics or perfumes to the kind of sex he liked to have, anything like that you could use to present him as being less than manly, less than masculine, effeminate, that was bad. And one of the ways that you could do this, you could attack him through his women. So basically, you could say, oh, his wife is the one that's wearing the trousers. She's the boss. And you're simultaneously denigrating him because he's being emasculated, but you're also denigrating her because she is transgressing the role of what a woman is supposed to be. And so we see this with Fulvia in that what she's doing at the time in her actual behavior is not so unusual, because this is a period of civil war. Plenty of men are going off away from Rome for years in their armies or into exile. And when men are not around, who's running the household? Who's running the family business, looking after the estates, looking after the children, working on their behalf to get them to come back? Of course it's their wives. And that's a normal thing that Roman wives are expected to do, because at this time, they don't go abroad with their husbands. They don't go with the armies. They don't go to provincial postings or anything like that. They stay at home. And so all the Roman women are doing this. We know Cicero's wife was doing this while he was exiled, for example. So that's not unusual, and it's not a bad thing to do. But the problem for Fulvia is that she is being used by Antony's enemies and Clodius's enemies, her first husband, as a way to criticize them. And we heard some of the things that are said about her in Cormac's introduction, that she had no time for spinning or weaving like a good Roman woman. She wanted to rule a ruler and command a commander, that the only thing feminine about her was her sex, And it's like, she was married 3 times and she had 5 children. So there was a lot more that was feminine about her, than that. She'd been pregnant, she'd had children, she'd had babies, she'd raised them, etc. So she knew plenty about how to be a woman and women's work. But because her husbands were important politically, she was, by implication, important politically too. And it's convenient. I mean, it's something that even 2,000 years later, political wives, no matter what side they're on, they get criticized. Cherie Blair, Carrie Johnson, they get the same allegations made of them, that they're money grabbing, that they're using their husbands' positions to earn lots of money, to buy lots of property, that they're whispering in their husband's ear and telling him what legislation that he should try and enact. And they get blamed when the prime ministerial or the presidential husbands screw up. It's somehow the woman's fault for not being a good enough wife or for leading them astray or whatever else. And so these sort of stereotypes, these stereotype allegations, they haven't dated, or well, personally I think they're extremely dated, but they're still being used today frequently, and it's also a way of removing the blame from men for their own actions. So the prescriptions are a case in point. The idea that Fulvia is adding names to the prescriptions list so that she can take their property and take their wealth. And that means that Antony and Octavian and Lepidus, the third of the 3, they get away with it because it's a greedy woman that made them do it. And it means that afterwards, when the dust settles, it's easier to sort of blame it on the person who's no longer around and who in their eyes, shouldn't have been there in the first place.
So, as you said, in this time period, women had no political roles officially. They had no military roles. Later, for example, Augustus's wife, we are told, accompanied him on his travels on campaign, but not in this period. So women were often left behind, keeping everything together. Sometimes even when their husbands were on the run from being prescribed, they would be holding everything together. But of course, this wasn't the case in the case of Fulvia, because she had a war. She directly participated in a war, the Perusine War, which is sort of credited in causing sort of the final friction and breakdown of her relationship with Marc Antony. And one of the most sort of famous artifacts, there's something that I knew about Fulvia before this, is the slingshots that were recovered from this war, with extremely sexualized messages on them, not just about Fulvia, about everyone involved, Octavian, Marc, everyone, but very pointed comments about Fulvia and slingshots going for Fulvia's genitalia, etc. How revolutionary do you think it was having a woman in a sort of military context like this? It set the stage for what was coming later, but how revolutionary do you think this was for the people around Fulvia at the time?
Well, this is a really interesting thing to think about, because we do know that women did have a role to play in ancient battles and siege warfare, because it was expected that if your city was under siege, that everybody, the elderly and infirm men, the women, the children, etc., anybody who wasn't in the army would, rise up in defense of their city. So we have stories about women, climbing up onto roofs and throwing roof tiles down at invading soldiers. We have stories about women cutting off their hair to use for catapult strings and bowstrings and things like that. So women were expected in extremis to participate in warfare, in an aggressive way within these parameters. I mean, of course, women were also with the army. We had the sort of the camp follower and the enslaved people who would support the army that we just don't tend to hear about. So women were adjacent to warfare. They they were on the receiving end of the unpleasant aspects of warfare whenever an invading army rolled through. So it's not like Roman women never have anything to do with weapons or war at all. The thing that's interesting about Fulvia is that she is placed as being a commander of the Roman forces in this time. And that is not, I think, entirely accurate. It's another way of trying to present her as being very transgressive and very sort of monstrous. Because at this time, Antony is away. Antony has gone to the east to sort out the provinces there, and he's also having an extended holiday in Alexandria with Cleopatra. It's getting very busy in Alexandria. This is the point where Fulvia and Cleopatra Selene overlap, because it's while Fulvia is back in Italy trying to defend Antony's honor that Antony is impregnating Cleopatra. So, this is how those two sort of overlap slightly. But anyway, Fulvia's story. So Antony's not there, and because he's not there, Octavian is trying to basically lure and bribe his soldiers and his veterans away from him. He's trying to give them land and basically make them his soldiers and veterans rather than Antony's. And Fulvia is not happy about this. Antony's brother Lucius, who is one of the Roman consuls at this point in time, is also not happy about this. And so the pair of them are trying to defend Antony's reputation, his honor, his relationship with his soldiers, as anyone would in this situation, because you don't want someone else getting the upper hand militarily and being in a stronger military position than you are. And so they both of them work hard to try and sort of win the soldiers back. And it does come to a sort of civil war on Italian soil. And this is a very difficult period to understand because nobody wants to talk about it later. The fact that Octavian, who becomes the Emperor Augustus, first tried to confiscate land from Italian and Roman people to bribe soldiers with, they don't want to cover that. And then that he actually did besiege Italian cities, and he apparently sacrificed Roman soldiers on the altar of Julius Caesar and all sorts of really horrible war crimes. That's all just sort of hushed up later on. And so the convenient thing to do with all these sort of later sources is blame it on Fulvia. Fulvia is the aggressor. Fulvia declares war on Octavian. Fulvia does this, that, and the other. She's not even there. She is not actually physically commanding the armies. Lucius is commanding the armies. He is the one that is in the city of Perugia under siege from Octavian and his forces. And so the slingshots are really fascinating objects because they're being sent by both sides. Octavian's forces are sending them into the city. Lucius's forces are sending them out. And they've all got really hilarious but also horrible messages written on them, attacking various aspects of all of these men, and that Fulvia as well, even though she's not there. And so the fact that she is being included in all of this is interesting for us because it does give us, like right at that point in 41 and 40 BCE, this is decades before the ancient literary sources were written about this period. So at that point in time, it does show us that Fulvia is very powerful and is very much in the forefront of everybody's minds, even when she's not physically present. And so that does give us this interesting balance to what the literary sources say later, because while we might want to dismiss them and say, oh, well, of course they hate her, you know, there is something there, and there is still something there all of those years later. She has made an impression, which a lot of other Roman women didn't necessarily manage to make.
Well, this leads me very nicely to the next question. So I was really struck in your book by the what ifs section. And this was your sort of discussion after Fulvia's death of what would happen if she had not died at that point. So she died not long after the war that Jane was just discussing. She goes into exile, and she has a short illness, and she dies in Greece. And Marc Antony leaves her. He's not there. But the question is sort of, what would have happened if she had not have died? What would have happened if she had reconciled with Marc Antony? What would that have meant for the future of his relationship with Cleopatra? But also, how the whole of Roman history and world history could have played out quite differently, because what unfolds from this point onwards is this great rivalry between Marc Antony, based in the east, often from Alexandria, and Octavian in the west. And you make the really legitimate point that, you know, as we said, Fulvia was at the center of things, but also Fulvia had Marc Antony's back. She had her, it was very vulnerable at this time to be away from Rome if you were a politician, because you were very vulnerable to having slander said about you, to having your property taken, having your will stolen from the Vestal Virgins and read aloud, having your veterans bribed, and having her in Rome protecting his interests was a really big thing, because what happened in terms of the slander that was sort of targeted at Marc Antony from this point is his relationship with this exotic Ptolemaic queen became part of accusations about him being seen as un-Roman and betraying his Romanness and betraying the city of Rome. Could you expand a little bit further on this sort of how you felt writing this sort of, oh, wait a second, if she hadn't have died, how might the world have looked a little different?
Yes, I mean, when we approach any period of history, we think we know who the main characters are, because they are the ones that we know, they are the ones that get the lion's share of the attention in the historical sources of that period. And particularly in Roman history, we often forget that the sources that we have were not generally written at the time. They were written decades, even centuries later, and we tend to look at them all and read them all And we think about, oh, where did they get this information from? But largely we use them as sort of narrative histories for this period. And as far as the fall of the Republic is concerned and the civil war between Antony and Octavian is concerned, we are dealing with sources that were written much later, that were written with a considerable amount of hindsight, and were written after Octavian, as the first Roman Emperor Augustus, worked really hard to clean up his image and improve his personal brand. And so everything that he did that was questionable is waved away or is blamed on other people, or is just mysteriously not mentioned at all in our sources. And Antony gets the blame for everything, and none of his writings that present his perspective survive. None of the pro-Antonian, because he had plenty of friends, and he had plenty of people that were in his camp, on his side. They wrote history too. None of those survive either. And so we have to try and reconstruct what those were. And when it comes to Fulvia, she didn't write anything. No one suggests that she wrote anything. And we don't have anything from her perspective. We don't have anything sympathetic towards her. And with this writing of hindsight, the ancient authors further this idea that these are the historically significant people. And we know that they're historically significant now because, well, we know they were historically significant then because they're still historically significant now. And we have to bear in mind that at the time when all the events were unfolding, people didn't know how the story was going to end. People were equally, some people were on Antony's side, some people were on Octavian's side. Presumably some people were on Fulvia's side as well and thought that everything that she was doing was perfectly legitimate. And so it could have gone either way for a long time. And there are people that disappear from the historical record because they die young. So, for example, Cleopatra's son Caesarion, the son of Julius Caesar, during his lifetime, he was extremely important because he was the son of Caesar, because he was the son of Cleopatra. He was king and pharaoh of Egypt. He was a living god. And he and Octavian were rivals. But Octavian has him murdered when he's 16. So he never gets to do anything significant. So he becomes a historical footnote, even though at the time there were plenty of prophecies circulating around Egypt and around the Near East that he was some kind of savior, as were Cleopatra's other children. And so we have to bear in mind that the history that we're reading they already know how the story ends, and so they present it as inevitable. And so what I started thinking about was, well, at the time, who was being significant at the time that through just sheer accident they die or they become exiled or they become marginalized, or we just don't know what happened to them because they stop appearing in the stories? Who are those people? And a lot of those people are women, and Fulvia is one of those people. So we know that she dies. It's a rather sad death. Antony is not at all grateful that she went to war alongside his brother to try and preserve his influence in Italy. He sees this as very politically inconvenient for him because now he has to try and patch things up with Octavian. And so he abandons her. She's on her deathbed and he just leaves. He doesn't say goodbye. He doesn't stay with her until she gets better. He's not there when she dies. And so it's what would have happened had she survived. I mean, he goes off to have a meeting with Octavian to try and come to some point of agreement and smooth things over and set the agenda going forward. And he's able to do this in part because Fulvia's dead and she's out of the way, and the pair of them can agree, yes, let's blame it all on her, draw a line under it, move forward. And part of that moving forward is he agrees to marry Octavian's sister. And this is a massive mistake for Antony. At the time, it seems like a great idea. The soldiers really want it to happen. It's the ancient equivalent of a royal wedding. Everyone thinks, fantastic, we've had all this war, let's have a party. And it's a really bad idea, because what that means is for the next decade, any time there's any trouble between Antony and Octavia, any marital disharmony becomes political. It becomes an insult to Octavian, because Antony's mistreatment of his sister is a mistreatment of him. It's an insult to him. And so gradually, he's able to alienate everybody in Rome away from Antony, because he's able to say, look, he's favoring the Egyptian whore who's not his wife over my sister, this good, pure Roman woman who hadn't, all of his children and done everything she was supposed to do. He's not Roman anymore. He's gone native. He's taken on all of these, Egyptian characteristics that are really bad. And if Fulvia hadn't have died, this would not have happened. So either Antony would have stayed married to her, and she would have been based in Rome when he wasn't there. She had 2 sons by him, and she had 2 other older sons by influential politicians. All of them could have protected Antony's reputation in Rome, in the Senate, in the streets with the people. He would have had 4 young men from 3 very influential Roman families all arguing his corner and stopping Octavian getting the upper hand in Rome. Fulvia would have been sort of engineering all of this. Her daughter would have been married into another family to provide another political alliance for Antony. And while Fulvia and her sons were taking care of Rome, Antony and Cleopatra and their children would be taking care of the East. And we would have had a whole series of royal dynasties in kingdoms around the Near East that were descended from Antony. So Antony...
There are some positives to his philandrophy.
Yes, he has so many children. He has at least 7 children that we know about. Octavian had 1, and she was a daughter. So Antony he is able to sort of repopulate all of the Roman political systems almost single-handedly. And so by doing that, by having a Roman Western Empire and an Eastern Empire that were all really under sort of Antony's purview, we would have had a very different Roman Empire. And because he wouldn't have married Octavia, they wouldn't have had their 2 daughters. The Julio-Claudian dynasty wouldn't exist, because apart from Tiberius, who is Octavian, Augustus's stepson, the son of his wife Livia, all the rest of the Julio-Claudian dynasty are descended from Octavian's sister, Octavia. And in fact, they're descended from Antony too, because of their children. And so if you take out that marriage and you take out those children, you lose the Julio-Claudian dynasty. And what a loss that would have been for history, really. So then we end up with this situation. Well, what does Rome look like then? Does Rome become an empire? Or does it continue to be a nominal republic, democracy, etc., albeit, an oligarchy of a kind ruled by Antony's descendants rather than one man? And so Fulvia is not really given credit for being this sort of very central figure, this linchpin, and someone around whom circumstances are very dependent. Because she's a woman, she's not given the credit for having that kind of power and that kind of influence. And because she dies, she's seen as basically a historical dead end. She's replaced by Cleopatra. All of the allegations made about Fulvia, they're made about Cleopatra too, because Cleopatra is serving the same purpose. She is a woman who is above her station. She is a woman that is emasculating Antony. It's all her fault that he did this, this, and this.
So early in your book, when you were discussing the source material, in particular the issue we have with the source material for Fulvia, which is mostly very critical, and some of it appears on the back cover here, as cruel as she is greedy, Cicero. You mentioned the fact that the what-ifs around positive accounts. We do have a fantastic, very positive funerary inscription for an aristocratic woman from exactly this time period called the Laudatio Turiae, which means the in praise of Turia. But even these very positive portraits, when we have them to balance against the negative, they tend to be very shallow. So they praise women in ways that uses cliches about female behavior. They're often generally written by fathers, husbands, sons. They praise them for their female qualities, for being caring, for being devoted, for spinning and weaving. And they don't tell us much about these women as three-dimensional, flawed, interesting human beings. So I wondered if you had a chance to write a little epitaph for Fulvia. From your perspective now, and with your values and contemporary values, what would you say about her?
I think it's interesting the way that Roman funerary inscriptions do tend, they even for the men, they tend to be very formulaic, because of course when someone's dead and you're spending the money to set up the inscription on their elaborate tomb, you aren't generally going to say something nasty about them. I mean, we do get some Roman inscriptions that they're clearly very hostile and they curse the dead person, so the dead person must have been atrocious. But most of them are very complimentary. And I think it's not very difficult to be complimentary about Fulvia, because if you take away the sort of political context of it, what did she do? She did exactly what Roman women were meant to do. She married 3 times. Every time she was widowed, she married again to a husband who was in the same sort of political sort of party, for want of a better word, to her husband. So she had political clout. She used it. She made strategic marriages to important, influential, wealthy, aristocratic men. So she wasn't marrying below herself. She was doing what she was expected to do as a Roman woman. She was having children that she was expected to do as a Roman woman. And she worked really hard to look after her husbands and look after her children, to preserve their lives in very difficult and dangerous times. So I think you could absolutely praise her tenacity and her loyalty and her cleverness. I mean, sometimes you see ancient women praised for their cleverness, and sometimes it's like intellectual cleverness, their education, and other times it's sort of different types of intelligence. And I think you could probably praise both of those for Fulvia. Clearly, she was a very intelligent woman and a very cultured woman, and was part of the sort of the sort of political and intellectual networks of her time. But she was also very practically intelligent. The fact that she was able to maneuver this period that so many other people failed miserably. We have so many accounts of terrible stories of women's experience in this period. That you have the women who their husbands were prescribed and were murdered, so they starve themselves to death, or they throw themselves on the funerary pyre, or pathetic endings like that. Or you have the women that betray their husbands for the money, or to get revenge because they were having an affair with a slave girl or something like that. So the fact that Fulvia was able to preserve her marriages and her husband's reputations and their estates and their properties, and she was able to look after her children despite being quite often specifically targeted. I think we can praise her a lot for all of those things. And we can praise her, I think, too, for the fact that she did have a very important role in Roman politics in this period. She was undertaking diplomacy on behalf of Antony when he wasn't in Rome. And she was engaging with kings and other politicians and army personnel and stuff like that. So she must have been very good at sort of people management and things.
So finally, we'll open the floor for some questions, if anyone has any.